In this video, we're going to talk about jobs and employment, and we're also going to focus on attempts that economists use to understand unemployment and the aggregates that they have created to calculate and measure unemployment. So the first question is, why is unemployment a problem? Well, there's a number of issues. The first one is that unemployment represents lost production. Our total GDP is lower when we have higher unemployment. When people can't work, they're not producing anything, and when they're not producing anything, that means there's less goods and services that are produced, and the GDP is lower. It's also true that the individual people who are not working don't have any income, and this devastates people's lives and the lives of their families. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about unemployment. So in this table, we can see two different calculations about employment and unemployment. The first one, in the first calculation, we have a certain population, number of people working, not working, and then we have an unemployment rate. So in the column labeled U3, which is one of the way that economists calculate unemployment, the unemployment rate is 3.6%. 6 million of the 163 million people in the population are not working, and so the unemployment rate is 3.6%. But we can take the same population, and if we calculate it a slightly different way, what we'll find out is that 102 million people of the 259 people in the population are not working, just because we define it and calculate it differently. So in that case, you might have almost 40% of the population not working. So the question is, which one is right? Is it 3.6% unemployment, or is there 40% of people who are not working and unemployed? And the answer is it depends on how you count. And so the counting or the measuring for unemployment is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the Department of Labor in the United States government. So they measure and publish data on employment and unemployment. And we can see that sometimes the rate is higher or lower. This is going back about 12 years, and there was a financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Before that, the unemployment was in this 4% range. It went as high as 10%, and then slowly came down over 2012, 14, 16. It was below 4% going into 2020, and then in 2020 we had the COVID-19 crisis, and unemployment shot up above 15% as the economy closed down and businesses shut down, and we dealt with the ramifications of the pandemic, and then it peaked around 15%, and then came down to about 10% shortly after that, and is now sitting in the beginning of 2021 around 6.5%. So gives you an idea of some of the unemployment figures that we've seen over the last 12 years. Now, this definition of unemployment is using the U3 definition, the official Bureau of Labor Statistics definition of unemployment. Now, we can also look at the amount of jobless claims, just to put the coronavirus pandemic into perspective and how devastating it was for jobs and employment. We typically would have a few 100,000 initial claims for unemployment each quarter. When we got up to the 2008, 2009 recession with the financial crisis at that time frame, it went up to 500,000 or 600,000, but then slowly came back down and sat in this range. And then we get to the coronavirus pandemic, and we had 3 million the first week, 6.6 million the next week. So more than 10 million in just a few weeks' time. So it gives you an idea of how significant the economic downturn was with regards to employment during the coronavirus pandemic. So let's look at how economists calculate unemployment. Well, the Census Bureau conducts a monthly survey about population to determine the status of the labor force, and the entire population of 330 million people in the US is broken down into two groups: into the working age population. To be in the working age population, you have to be 16 years or older and not somebody who's in jail or a hospital or otherwise institutionalized. And so those people are in the working age population. And the people who are not in the working age population, somebody who's too young to work under 16 years of age, or in a jail or hospital or some other institution, are not in the working age population. We then take the working age population and break it down further into two subgroups: people in the labor force and people not in the labor force. To be in the labor force, you have to be either working or you can be unemployed. But not all the people who are not working are considered unemployed. Only some of them are considered unemployed. To be counted as unemployed, you have to be without work but made a specific effort to find a job in the previous 4 weeks, or waiting to be called back from a job which you've been temporarily laid off from, or about to start a job in the next 30 days. So if you are not working, but you haven't specifically looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, you are not considered unemployed. You're not considered part of the labor force. You're in the working age population, but you're not part of the labor force because you're not employed, and you're not technically unemployed because you're not looking. And so if we look at this process on the graph here, we can see we start with the population, 330 million. We divide the population into working age and people who are not in the working age population because they're too young or they're institutionalized. We take the working age population and further divide it into the labor force, people who are working or people who are unemployed, and people who are not in the labor force, not working and haven't looked in the last 4 weeks. And so the labor force gets divided into employed and unemployed. So you can see we go through a number of steps. We divide the population a number of different ways to arrive at categories, which we can then use to make calculations. We take the population today in the country. We have a total population of 330 million. 260 million of those are in the working age population. They're above 16, they're not institutionalized. 70 million are below 16 and institutionalized. So the working age population is 260. We then divide the working age population into the labor force and the non-labor force. So 160 million of the 260 million that are in the working age population are in the labor force. 100 million people are not in the labor force, which means they're not working and they are not unemployed. They haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks. Of the 160 million that are in the labor force, 149 million are employed, 11 million are unemployed. So when we calculate the unemployment rate, we divide 11 into 160 and we come up with 6.9%. But you'll notice that um, what we're not counting is the 100 million people who are not working but are not considered part of the labor force. So when we calculate unemployment, we're calculating the number of people who are unemployed, not working, they have looked in the last 4 weeks for a job, and we divide that by the people in the labor force. Only the people who are working, the employed and the unemployed. So there's this big category of people who are left out. Some for good reason, some maybe not so much. And so we actually, as economists, look at three major indicators: the unemployment rate, which we just went through, but we also can look at the employment to population ratio, or the labor force participation rate. So we have more than one metric we can look at. And what you'll see is we probably have 9 or 10 metrics we can look at. We'll go through some of that. So the unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. So the denominator is the labor force, and the numerator is the people who are unemployed. And again, that's that 11 million people unemployed divided by the labor force of 160, it's 6.8%. So this is the standard definition of unemployment. When we hear in the news that the unemployment rate went to 6.8%, they're talking about this definition of unemployment. This is called U3. And this is the rate that economists normally talk about when they're talking about unemployment. Certainly, if they don't specify which measure they're using the U3 measure. And this rate will go up, um, unfortunately, during a recession and reach its peak. And then during boom times or periods of economic growth and activity, the unemployment rate will come down. So there's a relationship between the growth in the economy and unemployment as we would expect. Here's an example of the unemployment rate, the U3 rate over the last 70 years. You can see times when it's in this, um, 4% range, and then times when it's much higher. It comes up and down. These are the gray areas are recessions where we'd expect unemployment to be higher, and it is, and that's it. So if we draw a line across here, we might get a 5% number or slightly higher, 6% number, if we were to average all these periods of time. But sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it is 9, and then other times it's 6. So it goes up and down and works within that range. This is the U3 number that we're talking about. And of course, we can see over here in 2020, the coronavirus, the big shutdown, unemployment rate spiked up here to 15%, and then has proceeded to come down since then as the economy's gets back on its feet, struggles to get back on its feet, but is uh, slowly improving and getting back on its feet. As we mentioned before, the unemployment rate will increase during a recession and decrease during an economic boom. Another way of calculating or measuring unemployment or employment is to look at the employment to population ratio. So to do this, we take the total number of people who are employed as a numerator and the working age population, which is that larger number, as a denominator. And so if we do this for 2020, we'll find there was 149 people employed. There were 260 million people in the working age population who could have been employed. They weren't under 16 or incarcerated. And we get a labor force participation rate of 57.3%, meaning that of the working age population, 57.3% of them were employed. Now, some of the people who are not employed in the working age population, that are in that 260 million but not are employed, these might be people who are retired or independently wealthy, or there's some good reasons why people would be not included or would not be working. But there's also some negative reasons. Maybe there's somebody who wants to work but hasn't looked in the last 4 weeks, and those folks are just not counted in the U3 number, but they would be counted. They would be counted here. Now we can look at another metric, the third metric, the labor force participation rate. Here we divide um, that's the percentage of the labor force that's in the working age population. So in 2020, the labor force was 160 million people. That's employed and unemployed people. The working age population was 260, so that's a 61.53% labor force participation rate. So of the people uh, um, who are in the working age population, 61.3% of them were in the labor force. It's just another way to measure our utilization of labor resources. And you can see these last two, the labor force participation rate and the employment to population ratio, are broader measures that try to capture a larger or broader picture of the employment landscape. This is an example of the labor force participation rate. It's pretty low down here comparatively in the 1950s and 60s. It goes up in the 70s. It's very high here in the 2000 timeframe, and it's gone down somewhat um, in the last 20 years. Now, some of this increase here is probably because if you go back as far as the 1950s and 60s, there were many women who were not in the workforce, and certainly by the 1970s and 80s, they were in the workforce, and most families had two people working, that type of thing. So that would increase the labor force participation rate. But then also the economy was more productive, and that also creates a need for more workers and a higher labor force participation rate. So the reason that we study unemployment is we're trying to understand the underutilization of labor resources. And we use economists and the Bureau of Labor Statistics use U3 as the metric, as the correct measure. But U3, as we mentioned earlier, doesn't capture some of the people who are not working and maybe want to work, and that would be marginally attached workers and discouraged workers. So a marginally attached worker is someone who is not looking for work, hasn't met the category of looking in the last 4 weeks, but would work if a job was available. Sometimes they're discouraged workers. They've looked for a long time, they couldn't find a job, didn't go anywhere, and so they just kind of given up and stopped looking. And so these people are considered not in the labor force, and therefore not relevant to underutilization when we're using the U3 metric. But really, I think most people would agree from a common sense standpoint that they belong in the underutilization and unemployment calculation. So it's also true that part time workers, many of them are working part time not by choice, but because it's the only work they can get. And so some percentage of part time workers want to work full time, and U3 counts part time workers and full time workers the same. So if you're a part-time worker wants to work full-time, you're counted as employed, even though maybe you're not fully employed and certainly not fully utilized. So to deal with this, the Department of the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually creates and tracks 6 metrics, U1 through U6. U3 we talked about. That's the most common measure of unemployment, the U3 number. But there's two narrower measures, U1 and U2. U1 focuses just on the unemployed um, people who've been unemployed for 15 weeks or more. So recent unemployed people are not counted in U1 because maybe they find a job sooner rather than later. And so U1 tries to focus in on those longer term unemployed people. And then the second one is unemployed job losers, somebody who was just recently working and then lost a job if a big company lays off 100,000 people. That's what U2 is trying to capture. So we have two narrower measures, but then we have two broader measures that tries to scoop up some of those people who want to work but aren't counted in U3, like discouraged workers or other marginally attached workers and part-time workers, and that would be U4, 5, and 6. And so we can see all these metrics from 1994 to today um, on a chart. And of course, the U3 is in the middle. It's this green one here. And then we have the two narrower measures, the three broader measures. And so depending upon what you're trying to understand or analyze, you might use one of these metrics versus the other one. But U3 is generally the one that we hear about and talk about when we talk about unemployment. Now, it's important to understand the sources of unemployment. There's really three. There's frictional unemployment, there's structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. And we're particularly concerned about cyclical unemployment. So, frictional unemployment is actually considered a healthy type of unemployment because this is the natural unemployment that happens because people's lives are changing. Meaning, if I train and go to graduate school and I want to change my job, maybe I'll go from one profession to another. When I finish my degree, I might leave my one job and be starting another job and might wind up being considered unemployed. But this type of unemployment is not frictional unemployment is not so concerning because people have to be able to make changes in their lives, and there's going to be a little bit of friction or frictional employment that's associated with that, and that we don't worry so much about. Maybe you want to move to California, and you don't have a job initially. When you get there, you're going to kind of restart your life, or that type of thing. So this type of unemployment is all called frictional unemployment, and economists don't worry too much about this. The next type is structural unemployment, which is employment created by changes in technology or foreign competition. So when maybe we used to make steel here in the United States, it now is largely done in Korea or other parts of Asia. And so um, this whole industries that shifted overseas and people are unemployed as a result of that, though you have to kind of be retrained and find new jobs and new careers because for the most part these types of jobs are not coming back. They left for a structural reason. Now, ironically, economists aren't as concerned about this either. Um, and increasingly we're seeing more, I think, structural change in the economy and more structural unemployment. So maybe economists should be a little bit more concerned. But the one that economists are concerned about is structural unemployment. I'm sorry, so is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that happens as a result of economic downturns. When we have a recession, there's more unemployment. People lose their job because there's just a lack of economic activity. And so this is the when an employee gets laid off because there's no business. It's an economic downturn, and people are out of work as a result of that. And so because the business cycle has kind of ups and downs, when there are downs, we have this cyclical unemployment, and this is the one that economists are most worried about. So we say that the natural rate of employment is the unemployment that you have that only results from frictional or structural changes when there's no cyclical unemployment. And we're actually at full employment where the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of employment, meaning we're at full employment if the only unemployment we have is because of frictional or structural reasons. And when the economy is at full employment, there's no cyclical unemployment. That's the key thing about the way economists look at this. All unemployment is only frictional or structural. Now, the natural rate of unemployment changes over time, and the definition of full employment changes along with it. So, full employment, by definition, is when when the unemployment is only because of frictional or structural reasons. There's no cyclical unemployment in there. A lot of times, you'll hear economists reference 5% as the assumption for full employment, and there's really no magic to that number. It's just a number that they've kind of used over the years, and um, has become accepted. Although you can have full employment with unemployment greater than 5%, or you can have less than full employment with less than 5%. So that number could be a little misleading because it's not really based on anything other than conventional wisdom or that type of thing. So we know that the potential GDP is is the real GDP that gets produced when we're at full employment. Meaning, if we're at full employment, the GDP that gets produced, the real GDP, is our potential GDP. It's kind of like the best or the optimal amount of GDP that we can create if there's full employment. Now, when real GDP is less than potential GDP, well, then we have an output gap. We're not producing as much as we could be. And this happens when the unemployment rate is higher than full employment, meaning that there's some unemployment that's a result of cyclical unemployment. So this output gap can fluctuate over the business cycle. When we have recessions, there's going to be a positive output gap. When we have a boom period, you can have either no output gap or even a negative output gap. And you can see here on the chart, the red line is our potential GDP over time. The blue line is the real GDP. And when the real GDP is less than potential GDP, well, that means we have an output gap. That means that the unemployment rate is not equal to full employment, that the unemployment rate um, is less than full employment, meaning we have some cyclical unemployment in our unemployment numbers. And um, this is considered lost production or lost output as a result of there being cyclical unemployment, uh, as a result of there being employment that's less than full employment. Now, ironically, you can see here that the real GDP is above potential GDP. This is um, in most cases a temporary situation. We can sometimes go above the potential, but we can't stay there because the economy would overheat and we would experience some other things, which we'll get into in subsequent weeks and in a subsequent lecture. But we define the output gap as being a situation where the real GDP is less than potential GDP. Why? Because we're not at full employment, because we have some cyclical unemployment in our mix. And this is the real concern that we have as economists, is that when we have unemployment too high, it represents lost production, lost output. And so the goal of economists is really to minimize or eliminate the output gap and to make sure that we're at full employment and we have no cyclical unemployment.